Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to my channel. The High Elves are coming to Warhammer the Old World, so I grabbed a couple models from my collection, a Spearman and a Swordmaster. I'm trying to decide on a color scheme for a small army, and I'm leaning towards something similar to the box art. I'd like to paint them to a tabletop standard using a mix of contrast and classic techniques. So let's grab our brushes and get started. After assembling the models, I undercoated them with gray primer, followed by a heavy layer of white paint with my airbrush. I'm painting the shield separately so everything is easier to see on camera, but if I wasn't filming, I would paint the model fully assembled. I started off by painting the skin. I'd like these elves to have very pale skin, so I made a mix of equal parts contrast medium and Darkoath flesh. After the first layer dried, I painted a second to deepen the shadows. One of the defining characteristics of classic High Elves is really bright white. I like the look of a warm gray for shading white, so I diluted Stormvermin fur with contrast medium, about 1 part paint to 4 parts medium. Then I painted the mix on the white fabric and the shield. Apply this paint just like any other contrast paint. Work on one section at a time, and apply plenty of paint so it flows into all the recesses. Then use the brush to soak up any excess paint as needed. For a really bright finish, I like to rinse the brush and then use the clean brush to wipe away paint off the raised edges. It's kind of like getting a free highlight before the paint dries. Sometimes contrast paint will dry unevenly, especially on large, flat surfaces like the shield. It's really easy to fix with some glazing, and we'll do that later in the highlight stage. For now, let's move on to the rest of the base coats. Next, I painted the hair with Nazdreg yellow. I'm not worried if some of the paint gets on the armor, since I'll be painting that with an opaque paint later. Then I painted the spear shaft with Skeleton Horde. And while I had it on my palette, I also shaded the hair. I painted the wood on the back of the shield with Gore-Grunta fur. And then I painted the boots with Wyldwood. Next I painted all the metal with Iron Hand steel, and after the first layer dried, I painted a second for an even finish. I'm not worried if any silver paint gets on the unpainted areas, since I'll be painting those with opaque paint next. Then I shaded all the steel areas with Gryph-Charger gray. Even though this is a contrast paint, it works great as a shade. Before painting anything else, I'd like to add a highlight to the armor with a light dry brush of Iron Hand steel. Since these models are for an army, I won't have the time to highlight each individual scale on the armor, and a dry brush will still look good, but it will also get the job done much faster. I looked for any places where the shade dried unevenly, such as on the helmets, and I touched up those areas as well. With the highlighting done, I painted some of the details on the armor with gold. I won't paint everything gold though. I think it's a good opportunity to add some extra color to the model, so I'll save some areas to paint blue next. Then I shaded the gold with Skeleton Horde. Now is a great time for me to ask you to do those YouTube things that we all love so much. If you're liking the video so far, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. If you really like what I'm doing here and want to support the channel further, consider being a channel member. We have some perks including a Discord server and early access to videos. Before I paint the blue details, I want to outline those areas first with a technique called blacklining. I thinned down some black paint and carefully painted it around every area that's going to be blue. This will help give those sections added definition. I also painted a thin black line between any other areas that I felt lacked shading, especially around the gold. This is probably the most time-consuming part of the whole model, and you can paint as much or as little as you like. With all the black lining done, now it's time to paint the blue. Instead of contrast paint, we'll be using Caledor Sky, an opaque paint. There comes a point during the process of painting each model where I feel like contrast isn't worth it. Contrast requires having a white or near white base coat, and in order to use a blue contrast paint, I'd have to keep those areas really clean and avoid getting any paint on the primer. Or I would have to repaint all those areas white. It would take far more time to take either of those approaches, and I think the best option here is to use an opaque base coat instead. I think it's important to recognize when contrast is a good idea and when there's a better alternative. I tend to prefer contrast base coats in the early stages of a model, and then switch over to opaque paints about halfway through. Next I shaded the blue with Magos purple. I really like the way Magos purple looks over blue paint. It's a fairly transparent color, so the effect is subtle and it doesn't end up looking purple. If you would prefer something darker, I'd recommend Drakenhof Nightshade. The Swordmaster has a belt and a ribbon, and I want to paint those in a different color. I have some old High Elves in a blue-green kind of color scheme, and I think that color would be a good way to tie the armies together. Lupercal green is a really close match, so I base coated with that. This color is fairly transparent, and it will need a couple layers for an even finish. I painted the sword handle with Dryad bark. And then I painted all the gems with black. At this stage you could base the models and call them finished, but I'd like to add a few more details and highlights, so let's keep going. I like to paint the eyes on all of my models, even the basic troops. I think it's one of those small details that can make a big difference. First, I carefully painted the eyes black. Then I painted the eyes white, leaving a thin outline of black. Next, I added in the pupils with black, and I tried to consider the direction the model is looking. Let's highlight the white next, and the first thing I want to do is smooth out any areas where the gray shade dried unevenly, and for that I'm using a glaze of a very light gray, thinned with water. This is gray number 8 from my custom grayscale, and you can learn how to mix your own set in this video here. This gray is very light, basically a few drops of black paint mixed into a whole bottle of white. I also highlighted the fabric. I painted a glaze on the larger surfaces like the sleeves, and I painted a more opaque layered highlight on the smaller surfaces, like the bottom of the robe. Next I highlighted the edges of the white areas with a pure white paint. This is the main reason I like using the light gray first. The light gray lets us get something that looks like a bright white, but because it's not pure white, it still leaves the option of adding a highlight on the very edges. Let's highlight the blue next, beginning with Caledor Sky. The Magos purple shade ended up darkening the blue quite a bit, so I went back to the base coat color and picked out some of the edges. You can paint as much or as little of this as you like, and if you prefer the darker look, you could skip the highlights entirely. I'd like to add one more highlight to the blue, so I mixed in some Lothern blue with the Caledor sky, about equal parts. Since these are for an army, I don't want to spend too much time on the highlights, so I picked out just a few of the edges and corners. Next, I highlighted the green belt, beginning with a mix of Lupercal green and a very small amount of white paint. I painted this almost everywhere except for the deepest recesses. Then I added a little bit more white to the mix and highlighted the edges. Next, I highlighted the edges of the leather with Steel Legion Drab. The spear looks kind of sloppy, and I think a wood grain texture would look good on it. I painted a few fine lines along the length of the spear with Bonewhite. Then I highlighted the edges of the gold with a mix of Retributor armor and Stormhost silver. Then I highlighted the armor with Stormhost silver. I don't want to highlight everywhere with this, especially the scale armor. I focused the highlights mostly on the edges of the helmet, shoulders, and the blades. The last thing I have to do is paint the gemstones. From a black base coat, I painted the gem with corn red, leaving a thin black outline. Next, I painted the bottom half of the gem with a glaze of Evil Sun's Scarlet. And after that dried, I painted a crescent shape of Evil Sun's Scarlet along the bottom of the gem. I painted a narrow line of Fire Dragon along the bottom of the gem. And then I painted a very small accent of Toxic Yellow. Finally, I added 2 reflective dots with white. I attached the shield arm to the spearman with superglue. I used an old brush to apply a generous layer of wood glue to the bases, and then sprinkled on coarse gravel and fine sand. After the glue dried, I painted the base with thinned Rhinox hide, followed by a heavy dry brush of Mournfang brown, then a dry brush of Balor brown, and finally Bonewhite. I painted the rocks with Dawnstone, and shaded them with a mix of Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil. I painted the edge of the base with Mournfang brown, and after that dried, I applied patches of static grass with superglue. I'd like to give a big shout out to our channel members. Thank you so much for your support. It really is a huge help. If you want to be like these amazing people and help support what I'm doing here, just click the join button down below. Thank you. I always enjoy painting old world models, and I'm really happy to see the High Elves finally coming back. I'll have to get my hands on some of the plastic Sea Guard. I was never able to collect those back in the day. Are there any classic models you hope get re-released, or do you prefer all new stuff? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy painting.